They were 73 years old, broke, and had just 3 days before losing the borrowed trailer they called home when they spotted something impossible frozen in the ice, a ghost ship that would either save their lives or destroy what little time they had left together. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind off the Bering Sea cut through the small coastal town of Cold Point, Alaska, like a blade made of ice and regret. It was the kind of wind that made you question every decision that led you to this forgotten edge of the world, where the sun disappeared for months and hope went with it. But for most people who lived here, there was nowhere else to go. This was the end of the road, the last stop, the place you wound up when the rest of the world had moved on without you. Margaret and Henry Davidson sat in their borrowed single-wide trailer on the eastern edge of town, the propane heater struggling against the February cold. Margaret was 73, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, her hands rough from decades of work. Henry was 74, his back permanently bent from 40 years as a maritime engineer, his fingers swollen with arthritis that made even holding a coffee cup an exercise in determination. They didn't speak much anymore, not because they had nothing to say, but because after 51 years of marriage, silence had become its own language. Margaret sat at the small fold-out table, sorting through a stack of medical bills with the practiced despair of someone who knew the numbers wouldn't change, no matter how many times she rearranged them. Henry stood at the small window, staring out at the grey expanse of frozen harbour, his breath fogging the glass. The bills on the table told their story better than words ever could. Henry's cancer treatment from 3 years ago, $78,000. Margaret's emergency surgery last spring, $42,000. The house they'd lived in for 37 years, foreclosed and sold at auction 6 months ago. Their retirement savings depleted, their children scattered across the lower 48 with families and struggles of their own, unable to help even if they wanted to. The trailer they sat in belonged to Frank Mullins, an old colleague of Henry's who'd offered it when he heard about their situation. But Frank was selling the property, moving to Arizona to be with his daughter. They had 3 more days here. After that, there was a women's shelter in Nome that Margaret could stay at. Henry would have to figure out something else. At their age, with their health, the thought of being separated felt like a death sentence delivered in slow motion. Margaret set down the stack of bills and walked over to Henry. She slipped her arthritic hand into his, their fingers intertwining with the ease of half a century of practice. "We should take that walk," she said quietly, "before the storm comes in." Henry nodded. They'd been taking walks along the frozen shoreline every day since they moved into the trailer, partly for exercise, partly because the walls felt too close when you were trying not to think about the future. They bundled up in their worn coats, Margaret wrapping a faded scarf around her neck that her mother had given her 40 years ago, Henry pulling on the wool cap he'd worn since his Navy days. The cold hit them the moment they stepped outside, but they were used to it. You didn't survive this long in Alaska without learning to make peace with the cold. They walked slowly, carefully, toward the harbor. The town of Cold Point stretched behind them, a collection of weathered buildings and rusted equipment that told the story of a place time had forgotten. There were maybe 200 people left here now, down from nearly 1,000 in the 1970s when the fishing was good and the cannery was still operating. The harbor was frozen solid this time of year, had been since late November. Massive sheets of ice stretched out toward the horizon, broken only by the occasional dark crack where the water still moved beneath. They walked along the rocky shore, their boots crunching on frozen gravel, neither of them speaking. Above them, seabirds circled and cried, their voices sharp against the wind. They'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when Henry stopped. Margaret, lost in her own thoughts, took a few more steps before realizing he wasn't beside her anymore. She turned back. "What is it?" she asked. Henry was staring out at the ice, his eyes squinted against the glare. He raised one shaking hand and pointed. "Out there, do you see that?" Margaret followed his gaze. At first she saw nothing but ice and grey sky. Then slowly a shape began to resolve itself in the distance. Something massive, dark, angular. It looked like it was part of the ice itself, as if the frozen harbour had grown bones. "What is that?" Margaret whispered. "I don't know," Henry said, but there was something in his voice, a note of recognition, or maybe disbelief. "But I think we should take a closer look." They made their way carefully across the ice. What had looked like a short distance from shore turned into a 20-minute walk, and with each step, the shape grew larger, more defined. Margaret's heart began to pound, not from exertion, but from the growing realization of what they were seeing. It was a ship, a massive ship, locked in the ice, tilted slightly to one side. The hull was dark with age and rust, but the structure was unmistakable. And not just any ship, Henry realized as they got closer. This was an icebreaker, one of the heavy Soviet-era vessels built to cut through Arctic ice like it was butter. They stood at the base of the hull, necks craned back, mouths open. The ship loomed above them, at least 200 feet long, maybe more. Ice clung to its sides like frozen tears. The name on the hull was barely visible beneath decades of weathering, but Henry could just make it out. Northern Star, and beneath it, in Cyrillic letters, the original Russian name. "How long has this been here?" Margaret breathed. Henry shook his head slowly. "I've lived in this town for 18 years. I've never seen this before, but look at the ice around it. This thing has been here a long time, decades maybe." "How is that possible? How does a ship this size just sit in the harbour and nobody notices?" "The ice," Henry said, his engineer's mind working. "In winter, when everything freezes solid, it would just look like part of the landscape. And in summer, this far out, with the distance and the way it's sitting low in the water, it probably just looked like rocks or a small island. People see what they expect to see." Margaret walked around the visible portion of the hull, her hand trailing along the frozen metal. "Why would it be abandoned here?" "Good question," Henry murmured. He was studying the ship now with professional interest, his mind cataloguing details. "This is a Soviet-era icebreaker, probably built in the 70s or early 80s. Diesel-electric propulsion, reinforced hull, built to operate in conditions that would crush most ships." He paused. "But why it's here, abandoned, that's the mystery." They spent another hour exploring what they could reach from the ice, circling the ship, finding a Jacob's ladder hanging down the starboard side, frozen but intact. Henry's mind was racing now, not with despair about unpaid bills and uncertain futures, but with curiosity, with the engineer's need to understand. As they walked back to shore, neither of them spoke, but both of them were thinking the same thing. Here was something nobody else seemed to know about, or care about, or remember. Here was a mystery frozen in the ice, waiting. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed beside Henry, listening to his laboured breathing, the slight wheeze that never quite went away after the cancer treatment. Her mind kept returning to the ship, to its silent presence in the frozen harbour, to the questions it raised. Finally, she got up, wrapped herself in Henry's old navy cardigan, and walked to the small table. She opened her laptop, the same one their daughter had sent them 3 years ago for Christmas. The internet connection was terrible out here, slow and unreliable, but eventually she managed to pull up a search page. She typed, "Abandoned ships Alaska," then "Icebreaker Northern Star." The results were sparse, mostly general information about decommissioned vessels and Arctic shipping. But then, buried on the third page of results, she found something. A scanned newspaper article from the Cold Point Chronicle, dated October 19, 1983. The headline read, "Mystery Vessel Appears in Harbour." Margaret leaned closer to the screen, her heart beating faster. The article was brief, barely 3 paragraphs. It described how local fishermen had reported seeing a large ship anchored in the outer harbour in late September of that year. By the time anyone investigated, the ship appeared to be abandoned. There was some speculation about its origin, mention of contacting the Coast Guard, and then nothing. The article ended with a note that authorities were looking into the matter. That was it. No follow-up articles, no resolution. The ship had appeared, been noted, and then apparently forgotten. Margaret sat back, processing this. 1983. That was 43 years ago. The ship had been sitting out there for over 4 decades, and somehow it had simply faded from public consciousness. Frozen in winter, obscured in summer, ignored and abandoned. She heard movement behind her and turned to find Henry shuffling out of the bedroom, wrapped in his old robe. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Come look at this," Margaret said. Henry read the article over her shoulder, his expression growing more focused. When he finished, he straightened up, wincing at the pain in his back. 43 years, he said quietly. That ship has been sitting out there for 43 years. "Why would nobody do anything about it?" Margaret asked. "Bureaucracy, probably," Henry said. "Ship appears. It's registered to some foreign entity. Maybe there's a question of jurisdiction. Coast Guard says it's the Navy's problem. Navy says it's Coast Guard's problem. Everyone passes the buck, and eventually people just forget. Happens more often than you'd think." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then asked the question they'd both been dancing around. "Who owns it now?" Henry met her eyes. He knew what she was really asking. "If it's been abandoned for over 40 years, if there's no active claim on it, then legally, under maritime salvage law, it could be claimed by whoever files the proper paperwork." "Could we do that?" Henry sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "It's complicated. We'd need to research the ship's history, find out if there are any active claims, file with the Coast Guard, maybe go through Admiralty Court. It could take months. It could cost money we don't have." "How much money?" Henry thought about it. "Filing fees, maybe a few $100s. If we did all the research ourselves, if we represented ourselves in any hearings, we might be able to keep it under 1,000. Margaret looked at the medical bills still stacked on the table, then back at her husband. "We have $843 in our checking account." "I know. And 3 days before Frank needs us out of here." "I know that too." They sat in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down like the Arctic cold pressing against the thin walls of the trailer. Finally, Margaret reached across the table and took Henry's swollen hand in hers. "What do we have to lose?" she asked quietly. Henry looked at his wife, at the woman who'd stood beside him through 40 years of Navy deployments and engineering jobs that barely paid enough, through raising 3 children and burying both their parents, through his cancer and her emergency surgery and the slow, grinding poverty that had claimed their home and their savings. "Nothing," he said. "We have absolutely nothing to lose." The next morning, they drove into Anchorage, a 5-hour trip in their ancient Toyota truck that burned oil and made concerning noises on hills. They went straight to the library, a modern building that felt like a palace compared to the sparse collection of books back in Cold Point. Margaret had always been the researcher in their relationship. Before she retired, she'd been a high school teacher, history and English, and she knew her way around archives and records. Henry pulled up maritime law databases, while Margaret dove into historical records and Coast Guard filings. By late afternoon, they'd assembled a picture. The Northern Star had been built in Leningrad in 1979, one of a series of icebreakers constructed during the late Soviet era. It had served in Arctic research missions, mostly around the Bering Strait and Beaufort Sea. In September of 1983, it had appeared in Cold Point Harbor and was reported abandoned. The Coast Guard had investigated and found the ship empty. Crew quarters cleared out, no obvious damage, just deserted. There had been some back and forth about jurisdiction, some inquiries to the Soviet authorities who had denied any knowledge of the vessel's presence in American waters. And then, as Henry had predicted, the bureaucratic process had simply stalled. The ship was added to a list of abandoned vessels. There was talk of eventual salvage or demolition, and then it was forgotten. More importantly, there were no active claims on the vessel, no registered owner, no liens, no ongoing legal proceedings. The Northern Star was a ghost ship in every sense of the word. Henry found the relevant maritime law. Under the law of fines and salvage, an abandoned vessel in navigable waters could be claimed by whoever first asserted a legitimate salvage claim and could prove the vessel was truly abandoned. The process required filing with the Coast Guard, publication of notice in case any claimants wanted to come forward, and if no one did, the vessel could be awarded to the salver. "It's possible," Henry said, looking up from the computer screen. "It's actually possible." They spent 2 more hours at the library, printing out forms, documenting the ship's history, preparing their claim. Margaret used her teacher's precision to organize everything into a clear narrative. Henry used his engineering background to document the vessel's condition and specifications. By the time they left the library, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered mountains pink and gold. They stopped at a small diner for dinner, splitting a bowl of soup and a sandwich because it was cheaper that way. Margaret filled out the Coast Guard forms in her careful handwriting, while Henry added technical details. "What are we going to do with a ship?" Margaret asked at one point, the absurdity of their situation suddenly hitting her. Henry stirred his soup, thinking. "Sell it for scrap, probably. A vessel that size, even at scrap metal prices, could be worth something. Enough to pay off some of the medical bills, maybe rent a small apartment somewhere." "And if no one wants to buy it?" Henry shrugged. "Then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have stood up and claimed something instead of just waiting to be pushed around by circumstances." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. After 51 years, she knew when her husband needed to fight, needed to feel like he had some control over his life. The cancer had taken that from him. The medical system had taken it. The foreclosure had taken it. Maybe this ship, this frozen ghost in the harbor, could give it back. They drove back to Cold Point through the darkness, the truck's headlights cutting through the night. When they got back to the trailer, it was nearly midnight, but Margaret sat down and finished the paperwork. Henry signed where he needed to sign. Together, they sealed the envelope addressed to the Coast Guard District Office in Juneau. The next morning, Margaret walked to the tiny post office in Cold Point and sent the envelope certified mail, return receipt requested. The postage and fees cost them $47. They now had $796 left to their names. On the walk back from the post office, Margaret took a detour down to the harbor. She stood on the shore, looking out at the ship. From this angle, in the morning light, it looked almost noble, a steel giant sleeping in the ice. "What are you hiding?" she whispered to the frozen air. "What secrets are you keeping out there?" The ship, of course, didn't answer. But Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. She felt hope. That afternoon, Henry suggested they go back out to the ship. Margaret looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "It's February," she said. "It's 15 degrees outside. You can barely walk to the mailbox without your back seizing up." "I spent 40 years around ships," Henry replied, pulling on his coat. "I need to see it up close. I need to understand what we're dealing with." Margaret knew better than to argue when Henry got that look in his eye. She bundled up, packed some thermoses of hot tea and a first aid kit, just in case, and followed her stubborn husband back out onto the ice. The walk was harder this time. A fresh wind had picked up, driving small pellets of snow across the frozen harbor. By the time they reached the ship, both of them were breathing hard, their faces numb with cold. Henry walked along the hull until he found what he was looking for, a series of handholds welded into the metal, leading up to a service deck about 15 feet above the ice. The Jacob's ladder they'd seen before. "Absolutely not," Margaret said when she realized what he was thinking. "Just want to see if I can get inside," Henry replied. "You're 74 years old with arthritis and a bad back. You're not climbing anything." "Then you climb and I'll tell you what to look for." Margaret stared at her husband, then up at the ladder, then back at her husband. "You're insane." "Probably," Henry agreed. "But we filed a salvage claim on this ship. We need to know what we're claiming." Margaret had climbed worse things in her youth, before age and life had settled into her bones. She tested the first rung of the ladder. The metal was solid, frozen, but stable. She took a breath, said a small prayer to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, and started climbing. The cold metal bit through her gloves. Each rung required a commitment, a belief that the next one would hold. Henry coached her from below, his voice steady and calm, the same voice that had talked her through labor with their first child, through the night her father died, through 1,000 small crises over 5 decades. She reached the service deck and pulled herself over the railing, her arms shaking. The deck was covered in ice and snow, but mostly clear. She stood there for a moment, catching her breath, looking out over the frozen harbor. From up here, she could see Cold Point in the distance, small and fragile against the vast expanse of ice and sky. "You okay?" Henry called up. "I'm alive," she called back. "What am I looking for?" "A way inside. There should be a door or hatch somewhere on that deck." Margaret moved carefully across the deck, testing each step. At the far end, near the superstructure, she found it, a heavy metal door, dogged shut but not locked. The handles were frozen, but she worked them back and forth until they moved. With a final heave, the door swung open on shrieking hinges. Cold air rushed out, somehow even colder than the outside air, carrying with it the smell of old metal and abandonment. Margaret pulled out a small flashlight and shined it inside. She was looking at a corridor, narrow and dark, with doors leading off to both sides. Ice crystals glittered on every surface, but the structure was intact. No obvious damage, no signs of flooding or fire. "I'm going in," she called down to Henry. "Be careful. Watch for weak floors." Margaret stepped across the threshold. The beam of her flashlight swept across walls covered in Cyrillic lettering and faded signs. She walked slowly down the corridor, her boots echoing on the metal deck. The first door she tried was unlocked. Inside was a small cabin, 2 bunks, a desk, a chair, everything covered in frost but preserved like a museum display. She moved deeper into the ship, finding more cabins, a galley, what looked like a common room with tables and chairs arranged as if the crew had just stepped away for a moment and would return any second. In the galley, she found dishes still in a drying rack. In one cabin, a calendar on the wall showed September of 1983. It was eerie, this frozen snapshot of life suddenly interrupted. But what struck Margaret most was how orderly everything was. This wasn't a ship that had been abandoned in panic or emergency. This was a ship where people had left deliberately, carefully, taking their personal belongings, but leaving the infrastructure intact. She found a stairwell leading down to lower decks and then another leading up. Her flashlight was starting to dim, and she knew she shouldn't stay too long, but something pulled her forward. She climbed up, finding what must have been the bridge, the ship's control center. Instrument panels lined the walls, all dark and dead. The ship's wheels stood in the center, frozen in place. On the captain's desk, she found a logbook, the pages brittle with age and cold. She carefully opened it, shining her dying flashlight on the last entry, dated September 23, 1983. The text was in Russian, which she couldn't read, but she carefully tucked the logbook inside her coat. She was about to head back when she noticed something. In the corridor outside the bridge, there was a section of wall that looked different. She moved closer, running her gloved hand over the surface. It was a door, she realized, but painted and paneled to blend with the wall. And it had a lock, a serious lock, the kind you didn't put on a normal cabin door. Margaret tried the handle. Locked, of course. She made a mental note of the location and turned back. Her flashlight was nearly dead now, and Henry would be worried. She made her way back through the ship, more confident now, retracing her steps. When she emerged onto the deck, she could see Henry below, pacing back and forth despite the cold. "You were in there almost an hour," he called up. "I was about to come after you." "The ship is intact," Margaret called back. "Completely intact, like everyone just walked off one day and never came back." Climbing down was harder than climbing up, but she made it, landing heavily on the ice beside Henry. Her legs were shaking, her hands were numb, but her eyes were bright. "And I found this," she said, pulling the logbook from inside her coat. They made their way back to the trailer, Margaret describing everything she'd seen while Henry listened with growing fascination. Back inside, with the heater running and hot tea warming their hands, they sat at the small table and examined the logbook. "We need to get this translated," Henry said, turning the brittle pages carefully. "There might be information about why they abandoned the ship, where the crew went." "I saw something else," Margaret said. "A locked door, hidden door, on the corridor outside the bridge. It had a serious lock on it, Henry, the kind of lock you put on something you want to keep very secure." Henry looked up from the logbook. "Did you try to open it?" "It was locked. We'd need tools, bolt cutters maybe, or a cutting torch." They sat in silence for a moment, both thinking the same thing. Whatever was behind that door, someone had wanted it protected. Someone had thought it was worth securing even as they abandoned the entire ship. "One step at a time," Henry said finally. "First, we need to get the salvage claim approved. Then we can figure out what we're really dealing with." Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a routine. Every morning, Henry would check the post office box for any response from the Coast Guard. Every afternoon, they would walk out to the ship, Henry keeping watch while Margaret explored. She mapped the interior, documenting everything with the camera on her old phone. She found the crew quarters, the engine room, vast and silent, the cargo holds, mostly empty. And always she came back to that locked door. It called to her somehow, that hidden entrance outside the bridge. What was worth securing? What was worth hiding? They found a Russian woman in Anchorage, a translator who'd emigrated in the 90s, and paid her $50 to translate the logbook. Her translation revealed routine entries about ice conditions, navigation, scientific research, but the final entries were more cryptic. References to package secured and transfer complete. And finally, on September 23rd, mission concluded, vessel abandoned per protocol Alpha 9. "Per protocol," Henry repeated, studying the translation. "That means this abandonment was planned, authorized." "But why?" Margaret asked. "Why abandon a perfectly good ship?" "That," Henry said, "is the question." On the 17th day after they'd filed their salvage claim, Henry found an envelope in their post office box. Official Coast Guard letterhead, Juneau office. His hands shook as he opened it. The letter was brief and bureaucratic. Their claim had been received and logged. Notice of the claim would be published in maritime bulletins and relevant publications for 60 days. If no counterclaims were filed, a hearing would be scheduled to determine the validity of their salvage claim. They were advised to document the vessel's condition and prepare evidence of abandonment. Henry read the letter 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. Then he walked back to the trailer where Margaret was sorting through boxes, preparing for their move to wherever they were going to go. "We have a chance," he said, holding up the letter. "It's not approved yet, but we have a real chance." Margaret read the letter, then sat down on the edge of the bed. 60 days, she said. "That's 2 months. Frank needs us out of here in 3 days." The reality of their situation crashed back down. Even if they won the salvage claim, Even if they eventually owned the ship, that didn't solve the immediate problem of having nowhere to live. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the ship, about the locked door Margaret had found, about the cryptic log entries. Package secured, transfer complete. What package? What transfer? Around 2 in the morning, he got up, trying not to wake Margaret. He pulled on his clothes and his coat. He needed to think, and he thought best when he was moving. He walked down to the harbour in the darkness, his flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him. The ship was a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. He stood at the base of the hull, looking up. "What are you hiding?" he whispered, just as Margaret had weeks ago. "What's behind that door?" He knew he shouldn't. He knew it was reckless and possibly dangerous. But Henry Davidson had spent his entire life being sensible and careful, and where had that gotten him? 74 years old, broke, about to be homeless, and dying slowly from the inside out. He found the ladder and started to climb. The climb took Henry twice as long as it had taken Margaret. His arthritic fingers screamed with each grip. His back protested with every pull upward. Halfway up the ladder he had to stop, pressing his forehead against the frozen metal, breathing hard. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment he wondered if this was how it would end, frozen to the side of an abandoned ship in the middle of nowhere. But then he thought of Margaret, asleep in that borrowed trailer. He thought of the life they'd lived, always playing by the rules, always doing the right thing, always believing that if you worked hard and stayed honest, things would work out. And here they were at the end of it all, with nothing. He kept climbing. When he finally pulled himself over the railing onto the deck, he lay there for a full minute, gasping, his whole body trembling. Then he forced himself up and made his way to the door Margaret had found. It opened with the same shriek of frozen hinges. Inside, he used his flashlight to navigate the corridors Margaret had described. The ship felt different at night, more alive somehow, as if the ghosts of the crew still walked these passages. He found the bridge easily enough, and there, just as Margaret had said, was the section of wall that didn't quite match. He ran his hands over it, finding the seam, the outline of a door. The lock was serious, a heavy deadbolt mechanism, military grade. He pulled out the small toolkit he'd brought, the same basic set he'd carried for 40 years. He had no illusions about picking the lock. He'd never been that kind of engineer, but maybe he could see how it was constructed, what it was protecting. He examined the lock mechanism with his flashlight, noting the make and model. Soviet-era, high security, probably designed to resist tampering, but old, very old, and subjected to 43 years of Arctic cold. Metal did strange things in extreme cold. It became brittle, changed its properties. Henry knew this from years of working on ships in northern waters. He pulled out a small pry bar from his toolkit and inserted it into the gap between the door and the frame, right above the lock mechanism. He didn't try to force it. Instead, he applied steady, even pressure, letting the physics do the work. The cold metal resisted, then suddenly, with a sharp crack that echoed through the corridor, something gave way. The bolt mechanism had shattered, the frozen metal failing after decades of thermal stress. The door swung inward. Henry stood there for a moment, his heart racing. He'd just broken into a secured area of a ship he didn't technically own yet, a ship that might still belong to some government entity, a ship that might be protected by laws he didn't understand. But he'd come this far. He stepped through the doorway. The room beyond was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and it was different from the rest of the ship. Where the corridors and cabins had been frozen and covered in frost, this room was sealed, climate-controlled somehow. The air was dry and still, and in the center of the room stood a vault. Not a safe, Henry realized as he approached it. A proper vault, the kind you'd find in a bank. It was built into the floor and walls, reinforced steel, with a combination lock mechanism on the front. The vault was maybe 4 feet wide, 5 feet tall, and God knew how deep. Henry walked around it slowly, his flashlight revealing every detail. The construction was Soviet, heavy and overbuilt in the way Russian engineering often was, but what struck him was the condition. Unlike the lock on the door, which had failed due to age and cold, the vault looked maintained, protected, almost new. Someone had built this vault into the ship. Someone had secured something inside it. And then they'd walked away, leaving it here, hidden, forgotten. Henry tried the combination lock, more out of curiosity than any real hope. It didn't budge. He examined the hinges, the seams, the construction. This wasn't something he could crack with a pry bar and cold metal. This would require serious tools, cutting equipment, maybe even explosives. He stood back, studying it. The vault was approximately 4 feet wide, 5 feet tall, and the floor around it showed signs of reinforcement, suggesting it went deep into the ship's structure. Whatever was inside, it was heavy enough to require serious structural support. Henry spent another 20 minutes documenting everything with his phone camera, taking pictures from every angle, measuring dimensions with a tape measure from his toolkit. Then he carefully made his way back out, closing the door behind him as best he could with the broken lock. The climb down the ladder was terrifying in the dark, but adrenaline carried him through. When his feet finally touched the ice, his legs nearly gave out. He stood there, breathing hard, looking up at the dark bulk of the ship. "What the hell did I just find?" he whispered to the frozen air. He made it back to the trailer just before dawn. Margaret was still asleep, and Henry quietly stripped off his frozen clothes and slipped into bed beside her. His mind was racing too fast for sleep, but his body was exhausted. He drifted into an uneasy rest, filled with dreams of steel doors and locked vaults and secrets buried in ice. When Margaret woke him a few hours later, the morning sun was streaming through the thin curtains. She took one look at his face and knew. "You went to the ship last night," she said. It wasn't a question. Henry nodded. "I found what's behind that locked door." They sat at the small table, and Henry showed her the pictures on his phone. Margaret's eyes grew wider with each image. "A vault," she breathed. "There's a vault hidden on that ship." "Not just hidden," Henry said. "Protected, sealed, climate-controlled. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to keep whatever's in there safe." "What do you think it is?" Henry shook his head. "Could be anything. Documents, maybe. Classified information from Cold War research. Or it could be samples, biological or chemical, something they were studying. Or," he paused, "it could be something valuable." They sat in silence, both of them thinking the same thing, but neither wanting to say it out loud. Finally, Margaret spoke. "We need to open it." "I know, but we'd need equipment, cutting torches probably, and knowledge of how to crack a vault without destroying whatever's inside." Henry rubbed his swollen hands together, thinking. "I know a guy, Walt Peterson, worked with me at the engineering firm in Anchorage back in the 90s. He went into locksmithing after he retired, specializes in safes and vaults, does work for banks and government facilities. Would he help us? Only one way to find out." They drove back to Anchorage that afternoon, using precious gas money they couldn't really spare. Walt Peterson lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, his garage converted into a workshop filled with tools and equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. Walt was 78, rail-thin with a shock of white hair and hands that still moved with precision despite his age. He and Henry had worked together on a project retrofitting the locks on a federal building back in 1997, and they'd stayed in touch over the years. "Henry Davidson," Walt said, opening his door with a grin. "I heard you were dying." "I got better," Henry replied. They sat in Walt's workshop, and Henry showed him the pictures. Walt studied each one carefully, occasionally zooming in on details, his expression growing more interested with each image. "That's a Soviet Krasnaya model vault," Walt said finally. "They made these in the late 70s, early 80s, used them for secure storage on military vessels, research ships, anywhere they needed to protect classified materials or valuable cargo in extreme conditions. "Can it be opened?" Margaret asked. Walt looked up at her. "Everything can be opened, given enough time and the right tools. But this one," he tapped the phone screen, "this one is going to be interesting. The combination lock alone has over 1 million possible permutations. And see these plates here," he pointed to details in the photos. "Those are anti-tamper mechanisms. You try to force it or drill it, it triggers hardened steel plates that seal the interior. Whatever's inside would be inaccessible without cutting through several feet of reinforced steel." "So it's impossible," Margaret said, her voice flat. "I didn't say that," Walt replied with a smile. "I said it would be interesting. If I had my equipment, if I had time, and if I had access to the vault itself, I could probably get it open within a week, maybe 2. Henry and Margaret exchanged glances. "What would you charge?" Henry asked. Walt was quiet for a moment, studying them both. He saw the worn clothes, the desperate hope in their eyes, the way they sat close together like they were each other's only anchor in a storm. "Tell me the whole story," he said, "and don't leave anything out." They told him everything. The medical bills, the foreclosure, the borrowed trailer, the ship frozen in the harbor, the salvage claim, the 60-day waiting period. Margaret told him about exploring the ship, about the eerie preservation of everything, about the feeling that they'd stumbled onto something important. Henry told him about the logbook, about the cryptic final entries, about climbing the ladder in the dark because he couldn't sleep for wondering. When they finished, Walt sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You two are either the bravest people I've ever met," he said slowly, "or the craziest. Maybe both." He stood up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a worn notebook. "I've got nothing but time these days. My daughter keeps trying to get me to move to Seattle, live in some retirement home, play bingo, and wait to die. Opening a 40-year-old Soviet vault on an abandoned icebreaker in the middle of Alaska sounds a hell of a lot more interesting than bingo." "Walt," Henry started, "we can't pay you much. We can't pay you anything, really. Not until we know what's in there, if anything." Walt waved him off. "You give me a cut of whatever's in there if it's worth anything. If it's not, then I got a good story and a chance to work on a vault I've only ever read about in manuals. Either way, I win." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Walt would need to bring his equipment up to Cold Point, which meant renting a truck and making the 5-hour drive. He'd need to examine the vault in person, take measurements, understand its exact configuration. Then he'd need at least a week of uninterrupted access to work on it. "The cold is going to be a problem," Walt said. "Some of my tools won't work properly in extreme temperatures. We might need to rig some kind of heating system around the vault, create a warm working environment." "The ship has a generator," Henry said. "Diesel-powered. I saw it in the engine room. If we could get fuel and get it running, we'd have power for lights and heaters." Walt nodded. "Then that's step 1. Get that generator running." They drove back to Cold Point as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of purple and gold. Margaret was quiet for most of the drive, and Henry knew she was processing everything, turning it over in her mind the way she did. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked finally. "I don't know," Henry answered honestly, "but I know we're doing something. We're not just sitting around waiting for life to happen to us anymore. What if there's nothing in the vault? What if it's empty, or full of old paperwork, or something worthless?" "Then we'll know," Henry said, "and we'll deal with whatever comes next. But Maggie, what if there's something? What if there's something that changes everything?" Margaret reached over and took his hand. After 51 years, she knew when to push and when to let him hope. That night, word started to spread in Cold Point. Somebody had seen them making multiple trips out to the ship. Somebody else had noticed Henry limping more than usual, his back clearly bothering him. In a town of 200 people, secrets didn't last long. The next morning, when Margaret went to the small general store for supplies, she felt the stares. Conversation stopped when she walked in. The clerk, a woman named Donna, who'd always been friendly, was suddenly cold and distant. Margaret bought a few essentials and left, her cheeks burning. As she walked back to the trailer, she saw Mrs. Crawford, an elderly woman who lived 3 trailers down, watching from her window. When their eyes met, Mrs. Crawford didn't wave or smile. She just stared. That afternoon, there was a knock on their door. Henry opened it to find 3 men standing there. Tom Bailey, who ran the only bar in town, Rick Moss, a fisherman, and Carl Stevens, who'd lived in Cold Point his whole life and served as the unofficial mayor in a town too small for official anything. "Henry," Carl said, his voice neutral, "we need to talk." They stood awkwardly in the small living room, the 3 men large and uncomfortable in the cramped space. Finally, Carl spoke. "People are talking," he said, "about you and Margaret, about the ship, about what you're doing out there." "We filed a legal salvage claim," Henry said carefully. "Everything by the book." "That ship has been sitting there for 40 years, Tom Bailey said. "Belongs to the sea now, far as most folks are concerned." "Legally, it doesn't belong to anyone," Henry replied. "That's why we were able to file the claim." Rick Moss shifted his weight. "Word is you found something on that ship, something valuable." Henry kept his expression neutral. "We found an old ship that was abandoned, that's all." "Is it?" Carl asked. "Because Walt Peterson was seen loading equipment into a truck yesterday in Anchorage. Expensive equipment, vault-cracking equipment. And somebody said they saw him talking to you and Margaret." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. They'd been careful, but not careful enough. In Alaska, even in the cities, people talked, people noticed. "We're exploring our options," Henry said evenly. "If there's anything of value on that ship, it would help us settle our debts and find a place to live. I don't think that's unreasonable. What happens next will turn their discovery into a fight that threatens their safety, their marriage, and their lives, forcing them to decide just how far they're willing to go for hope when powerful people want them to disappear. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Carl Stevens was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he said, "Whatever you found, whatever you think you found, you need to be careful. This town has seen people come and go, seen fortunes rise and fall, mostly fall, and when outsiders start circling something valuable, it never ends well for the little guy." "We're not outsiders," Margaret said quietly. "We've lived here for 18 years. "You're not from here," Tom Bailey said bluntly. "And that ship, whatever secrets it's holding, it's been part of this harbor longer than you've been in this town. Some folks think whatever's on it should stay here, should benefit the community if it benefits anyone." Henry felt his temper rising, something that rarely happened. The community had 43 years to do something about that ship. 43 years to file a claim, to investigate, to care. Nobody did. We did. Rick Moss stepped forward. "Listen, Henry, we're not here to threaten you. We're here to give you friendly advice. There are people in this town who are struggling just like you. People who might feel like you're taking something that could help everyone and keeping it for yourselves." "We don't even know if there's anything worth taking," Margaret said. "We don't know what's in that vault, if anything, and legally, we have every right to find out." The 3 men exchanged glances. Finally, Carl nodded. "You're right about the legal part. Just remember that legal and smart aren't always the same thing. You watch yourselves." After they left, Henry and Margaret sat in silence. The temperature in the room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. "They're scared," Margaret said finally. "Scared that we found something, scared they'll miss out." "Or scared of what will happen if we did find something," Henry added. "If there's something valuable on that ship, it's going to bring attention. Federal attention, maybe. This town has stayed under the radar for decades. A lot of people like it that way." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She got up and made tea, sitting at the small table, staring at the pictures of the vault on Henry's phone. What was inside? Documents? Artifacts? She thought about the logbook entry. Package secured, transfer complete. A package, something specific, something important enough to hide in a vault on an abandoned ship, something worth protecting for over 40 years. Her laptop sat on the table, and on impulse, she opened it and started searching. She typed, "Cold War Secret Shipments Alaska," and started reading. What she found made her hands shake. During the late 70s and early 80s, Alaska had been a crucial point in the Cold War. The Bering Strait, only 51 miles wide at its narrowest point, separated the Soviet Union from the United States. Ships traveled these waters constantly, some openly, some in secret. There were stories, declassified now but obscure, about defectors being smuggled out of Russia, about Soviet officials who wanted to escape, who carried with them documents, information, sometimes money. The CIA had run operations, so had the KGB, and some of those operations had used ships, vessels that would disappear into the ice, complete their mission, and vanish. Margaret read about a particular operation codenamed Arctic Angel that had supposedly extracted a high-ranking Soviet scientist in 1983. The scientist had brought something with him, something valuable. The official records were vague, classified, but rumors persisted. Money, some said. Bearer bonds, gold. Others claimed it was information, microfilm or documents that could embarrass both governments. And the operation had supposedly concluded in September of 1983. The same month, the Northern Star appeared in Cold Point Harbor. The same month, it was abandoned. Margaret sat back, her heart racing. What if the vault didn't just contain documents or artifacts? What if it contained whatever that Soviet scientist had brought with him when he defected? What if the Northern Star had been the extraction vessel, and the vault had been built to secure the package until it could be safely retrieved? But then why was it never retrieved? Why abandon the ship and everything in it? She was still researching when Henry woke up 3 hours later. She showed him what she'd found, and together they went deeper, finding more fragments, more pieces of a puzzle that had been classified and buried for 4 decades. "If this is true," Henry said slowly, "if that vault contains what we think it might contain, we're not just dealing with salvage law. We're dealing with national security, international relations, classified operations." "Should we stop?" Margaret asked. "Should we just walk away?" Henry looked at his wife, really looked at her. She was 73 years old, her face lined with years of struggle and sacrifice. Her hands were rough from work, her eyes tired from worry. They'd played by the rules their whole lives, and the rules had left them with nothing. "No," he said quietly, "we don't walk away. Whatever's in that vault, we have a legal right to it under salvage law, and if someone wants to take it from us, they're going to have to prove we don't." Walt Peterson arrived 4 days later, his rental truck loaded with equipment. He'd brought cutting torches, precision drills, electronic lock-picking devices, heating elements, and enough technical equipment to crack Fort Knox. The 3 of them stood on the ice looking up at the ship. "She's a beauty," Walt said admiringly. "Never thought I'd get to work on a Soviet icebreaker." They spent the first day just getting the generator running. Henry had been right. It was a massive diesel unit, built to power the entire ship. With Walt's help and some jerry-rigged fuel lines connected to drums of diesel they'd purchased in Anchorage, they got it started. The rumble echoed across the frozen harbor, and lights flickered on throughout the ship. The sudden illumination revealed details they'd missed before. The ship was in remarkable condition, better than any of them had expected. The crew had maintained it right up until the moment they left. In the galley they found a generator maintenance log, the last entry dated September 22, 1983. "All systems operational, fuel reserves sufficient for 6 months. They set up a work area around the vault, hanging heavy plastic sheeting to create an enclosed space. Walt positioned portable heaters to keep the temperature above freezing, essential for his equipment to function properly. Then he began his examination of the vault itself. He spent an entire day just studying it, taking measurements, analyzing the lock mechanism, identifying the anti-tamper systems. He drilled a tiny hole, no wider than a hair, and inserted a fiber-optic camera to peek inside. "Well?" Margaret asked when he finally pulled the camera out. Walt looked at them both, his expression serious. "There's definitely something in there. I can't tell exactly what, the angle is limited, but I saw metal containers, multiple containers, stacked and secured, professional packing, military-grade storage." "Can you open it?" Henry asked. "Yes," Walt said, "but it's going to take time, and once I start, there's no going back. The anti-tamper mechanisms mean I get one chance. If I make a mistake, those hardened steel plates deploy, and whatever's inside stays inside forever." They started the next morning. Walt worked with a precision that was almost meditative, using his electronic tools to map the internal mechanisms of the lock. He explained as he worked, talking about tumblers and gates, about how Soviet engineers had designed these locks to resist not just picking, but any form of forced entry. Henry and Margaret took turns keeping watch, both on the ice and monitoring the approach from town. They'd set up a simple alarm system, fishing line with bells attached, stretched across the ice at various points. If anyone approached, they'd hear it. On the third day of Walt's work, the bells rang. Henry went to investigate and found Carl Stevens standing about 50 feet from the ship, his hands in his pockets, his expression troubled. "Carl!" Henry called out. "Something I can help you with." Carl walked closer, his boots crunching on the ice. "Wanted to see for myself what you're doing out here." "We're exercising our legal salvage rights," Henry said evenly. "Federal agents were in town yesterday," Carl said quietly. "Two men in suits, asking questions about the ship, about you and Margaret, about who else had been out here." Henry felt his stomach drop. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth, that an old couple filed a salvage claim, that they'd been exploring the ship, that they'd hired some help. I didn't mention the vault." He paused. "But Henry, if I figured out you found something, those agents did too. And if they're asking questions, it means somebody, somewhere, knows about this ship and doesn't want it disturbed." "It's been here for 43 years, Henry said. "If it was that important, they would have done something about it decades ago." Carl shook his head. "Maybe they thought it was lost. Maybe they thought the vault would never be opened. Or maybe," he looked Henry in the eye, "maybe they were waiting to see if anyone would find it and what they'd do when they did." That night, Henry told Margaret and Walt about the federal agents. They sat in the sealed work area around the vault, the heaters humming, the ship creaking around them. "We could stop," Walt said. "Pack up, go home, pretend we never found this." "And then what?" Margaret asked. "We still have no place to live. We still have debts we can't pay. And now we know there's something in this vault, something worth federal attention. If we walk away, someone else will come, someone with more resources, and they'll take whatever's here." "She's right," Henry said. "We've come too far to stop now." Walt nodded slowly. "Then I work faster. If federal agents are circling, we don't have much time." He worked through the night, only stopping for coffee and brief rests. Henry and Margaret spelled each other keeping watch, but the ice remained empty. As dawn approached on the fourth day, Walt made a sound, something between a laugh and a gasp. "I'm through the first security layer," he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "2 more to go." By noon, he'd defeated the second layer. The vault was giving up its secrets reluctantly, but Walt was relentless, his old hands still steady despite hours of precise work. At 3 in the afternoon, something clicked deep within the mechanism. Walt froze, listening. Then, carefully, he turned the main wheel. It resisted, then slowly began to move. "It's opening," he whispered. The three of them stood there as Walt worked the wheel through its full rotation. There was a deep thunk as the final bolt retracted. Then Walt gripped the handle and pulled. The vault door swung open. The interior was dark, but Walt's flashlight revealed what the fiber-optic camera had hinted at. Metal containers, dozens of them, each about the size of a shoebox, stacked neatly on metal shelves. Each container was labeled in both Russian and English. Walt pulled out the nearest one. It was heavy, surprisingly heavy. He set it on the floor and carefully opened the sealed lid. Inside were bundles of currency, US dollars, all in $100 bills. Each bundle was wrapped in plastic, sealed and preserved. Walt picked up one bundle, his hands shaking. There had to be $10,000 in that single bundle, and the container held at least 50 bundles. "Sweet Jesus," Walt breathed. Margaret reached for another container. Inside were more bundles of currency, but these were different. British pounds, German Deutschmarks, French francs, Japanese yen. A third container held gold bars, small ones, but each stamped with Soviet hallmarks and dates from the early 80s. A fourth container, opened by Henry with trembling hands, revealed something else entirely. Bearer bonds, negotiable securities that could be cashed by whoever held them. Each bond was worth $100,000, and there were dozens of them, all issued by various international banks in the early 1980s. They worked in stunned silence, opening container after container. Some held currency, some held gold, some held bonds or other negotiable securities. One contained diamonds, loose stones carefully wrapped and labeled. Walt, who'd worked on countless vaults over his career, who'd seen safety deposit boxes and bank vaults and corporate safes, stood there with tears running down his weathered cheeks. "In all my years," he said hoarsely, "I've never seen anything like this." Margaret pulled out a waterproof document case from the back of the vault. Inside were papers, manifests, transfer documents, all in Russian with English translations attached. She read through them quickly, her teacher's brain processing the information. "This was a defector package," she said, her voice shaking. "A Soviet official, someone high-ranking, they extracted him in September of 1983. He brought this with him, his insurance policy, his payment for whatever information he provided. The plan was to secure it on the ship until it could be safely transferred to CIA custody." "What happened?" Henry asked. Margaret kept reading, flipping through documents. "The extraction went wrong somehow. The official made it out, but there was concern about Soviet pursuit, about the operation being compromised. The decision was made to abandon the ship, to leave it here with the package secured, to come back for it later when it was safe." "But they never came back," Walt said. "No," Margaret confirmed, still reading. "According to these documents, the operation was classified beyond top secret. Only 3 people knew about the vault and what it contained. 2 of them died in a plane crash in 1984. The third," she looked up, her face pale. "The third died of a heart attack in 1997. The secret died with them." They sat in silence, surrounded by containers holding a fortune. Walt finally broke the silence. "We need to count it," he said. "We need to know exactly what we have." They spent the next 6 hours documenting everything, photographing each container, counting bundles, cataloging gold bars and bearer bonds. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, and they had a number. The vault contained approximately $290 million in various forms: currency, gold, bonds, and gems. Some of it would be difficult to liquidate, the bearer bonds especially, and some of the foreign currency had been replaced by euros decades ago. But even accounting for complications and depreciation, they were looking at a fortune worth over $200 million in accessible value. Henry Davidson, 74 years old, dying slowly from cancer, about to be homeless, sat on the floor of the ship surrounded by more money than he'd ever imagined, and he started to laugh. Not a happy laugh, but the laugh of someone who'd played by the rules his whole life and finally found out what it felt like to win. Margaret sat beside him, taking his hand, and she was crying and laughing at the same time. Walt just shook his head. 10% of accessible value was our deal, he said quietly. I just became a very rich man for opening one vault. They sealed the vault back up, every container returned to its place, everything documented and photographed. As they made their way off the ship in the darkness, Henry looked back at the dark silhouette against the night sky. They had found it. They had actually found it. Now came the hard part, keeping it. When they got back to the trailer, there was a car parked outside, a black sedan with government plates, and standing beside it, waiting in the cold, were two men in dark suits and serious expressions. The federal agents had arrived. The two men didn't introduce themselves at first. They just stood there in the dim light from the trailer's porch, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. One was tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses, the other shorter and broader with a military bearing. Both wore expressions that suggested they'd done this kind of thing many times before. "Mr. and Mrs. Davidson," the taller one said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Agent Cooper. This is Agent Mills. We're with the Department of Defense. We need to talk about the ship." Henry felt Margaret's hand tighten in his. Walt stood slightly behind them, his expression carefully neutral. "It's late," Henry said evenly, "and we've had a long day. Whatever you need to discuss can wait until morning." "I'm afraid it can't," Agent Mills said. His voice was rougher, more direct. "We're aware you've been exploring the Northern Star. We're aware you've hired specialist equipment and personnel, and we're aware you've accessed secured areas of that vessel. We filed a legal salvage claim," Margaret said, her teacher's voice coming through firm and clear. "Everything we've done has been within our rights under maritime law." Agent Cooper smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maritime law is complicated, Mrs. Davidson, especially when national security is involved. That ship and everything on it may fall under classified operations protocols." "May fall under," Henry repeated. "But you're not sure, are you? Because that ship has been sitting in this harbor for 43 years and nobody cared about it until now." The agents exchanged glances. Agent Mills shifted his weight, and Henry noticed the bulge of a shoulder holster under his jacket. "We're prepared to make you a very fair offer," Agent Cooper said, pulling a folder from inside his coat. "The government will purchase your salvage rights for $50,000. That's more than generous for a ship that's barely worth scrap value. All you have to do is sign over your claim and walk away. $50,000. 2 months ago, that would have seemed like a fortune. It would have paid their medical bills, given them enough for first and last month's rent somewhere, bought them breathing room. But now, after seeing what was in that vault, it felt like an insult. "No," Henry said quietly. Agent Mills's expression hardened. "Mr. Davidson, you need to understand the situation you're in. That ship may contain materials related to classified operations. Accessing those materials without proper clearance is a federal crime. We can make this easy, or we can make it very difficult." "Are you threatening us?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp. "We're explaining the reality," Agent Cooper said smoothly. "You're elderly, you have health issues, you have debts. A prolonged legal battle with the federal government would destroy you financially and physically. Take the offer. Move on with your lives." Walt stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Unless you have a warrant or some kind of court order, I think you should leave. These people have done nothing illegal, and you're trespassing on private property." Agent Mills turned his cold gaze on Walt. "And you are?" Walt Peterson, master locksmith, vault specialist, and someone who knows exactly what kind of permits and authorizations you'd need to seize property from civilians without compensation. "Do you have those authorizations, Agent Mills?" The silence stretched out. Finally, Agent Cooper tucked the folder back into his coat. "You have 24 hours to consider our offer," he said. "After that, things become more complicated. We'll be in touch." They got in their car and drove away, the taillights disappearing into the darkness. Henry, Margaret, and Walt stood there in the cold, none of them speaking until the sound of the engine had completely faded. "They know," Margaret whispered. "They know what's in the vault." "Probably," Walt agreed. "But they can't prove it, not without accessing it themselves, and they can't access it without either your permission or a court order, which they'd have to justify. If that vault contains what I think it contains, a lot of people would have to answer very uncomfortable questions about how it got there and why it was left for 43 years. Henry looked at his old friend. "This is going to get ugly, isn't it?" Walt nodded. "Very ugly. But you have leverage. That's why they came here trying to buy you off instead of just taking it. They're scared of what you might expose if this becomes public." That night, none of them slept. They sat around the small table, drinking coffee, planning their next move. Walt suggested they needed a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but someone who specialized in maritime law and wasn't afraid of federal agencies. Margaret researched on her laptop, finding a firm in Seattle that had successfully defended salvage claims against both private companies and government entities. At 6 in the morning, she sent an email explaining their situation. By 8, she'd received a response requesting a video call. The lawyer's name was Diane Chan, 40-something, sharp-eyed, with a reputation for being absolutely fearless in court. She listened to their story without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "This is going to be the fight of your lives," she said finally. "The federal government doesn't like losing, especially when classified operations are involved. They'll use every trick, every delay, every pressure tactic they have. They'll audit your taxes, investigate your backgrounds, make your lives miserable in ways you can't imagine." "But can we win?" Henry asked. Diane smiled, and it was sharp as a knife. "Yes, maritime salvage law is actually very clear. If the vessel was truly abandoned, if there are no active claims, and if you followed proper procedure, the salvage belongs to you. The government would have to prove either that the ship wasn't abandoned or that the contents of the vault are classified materials that supersede salvage rights. And if they do that, they have to explain what those materials are and why they were left on an abandoned ship for 4 decades. "What do you charge?" Margaret asked. "My retainer is usually $25,000, Diane said. "But this case interests me. This case has the potential to set precedent, to clarify some murky areas of maritime law. I'll take it for $10,000 up front and 15% of whatever you recover." Henry and Margaret looked at each other. $10,000 was almost everything they had left. But without proper legal representation, they'd lose everything anyway. "We'll need a day to get the money together," Henry said. "You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow," Diane replied. "After that, my rate goes back to standard. And Mr. and Mrs. Davidson, don't talk to those federal agents again without me present. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Don't even confirm that you found a vault. Understand?" They understood. The next morning, Henry and Margaret drove to Anchorage and withdrew almost their entire remaining savings. They wired it to Diane's firm and officially retained her as their legal counsel. On the drive back, Margaret stared out the window at the frozen landscape. "We just bet everything we have left," she said quietly. "I know," Henry replied, "but what choice did we have?" By the time they got back to Cold Point, the story had leaked. They didn't know how. Maybe someone had overheard the federal agents, maybe someone in Anchorage had talked. But the small town was buzzing. People stared at them openly now, and not all the looks were friendly. That afternoon, there was a town meeting at the community center. Henry and Margaret weren't officially invited, but they went anyway. The room was packed, maybe 70 or 80 people, nearly half the town's population. Carl Stevens stood at the front, trying to maintain order as people shouted questions and accusations. When Henry and Margaret walked in, the room went quiet. "Well," Carl said heavily, "I guess we might as well hear it from them directly. Henry, Margaret, you want to tell folks what's going on with that ship?" Henry stood, feeling every eye in the room on him. "We found an abandoned Soviet icebreaker frozen in the harbor. We filed a legal salvage claim. We're within our rights under maritime law." "And the federal agents?" someone called out. "Why are they here?" "The ship may have been involved in classified operations during the Cold War," Henry said carefully. "The government is interested in it." "Interested enough to offer you money?" Tom Bailey stood up, his face red. "Word is they offered you 50,000 to walk away. That true?" "Yes," Henry said. "We declined." The room erupted, people shouting, some supportive, most angry. A woman Henry didn't know well stood up. "That ship has been part of this harbor for longer than most of us have lived here," she said. "If there's something valuable on it, it should benefit this town, not one couple." "The town had 43 years to claim it," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Nobody did. We did the work, we took the risk, we filed the claim." "What did you find?" Rick Moss demanded. "Everyone's talking about a vault, about you bringing in some vault expert from Anchorage. What's in it?" Henry and Margaret exchanged glances. Diane had told them not to confirm the vault's existence, but the whole town already knew. "We're not at liberty to discuss that," Henry said. "There are legal proceedings underway." "That's bullshit!" Tom Bailey shouted. "You found something worth federal attention, something worth hiring fancy lawyers for. You owe this community honesty." "We don't owe anyone anything," Margaret said, her voice hard. "We've lived in this town for 18 years. We've paid our taxes, been good neighbors, helped when we could. We're in debt up to our eyeballs, about to lose everything, and nobody offered to help until they thought we might have found something worth taking." The room went silent at that. Margaret continued, her teacher's voice ringing clear. "Where were all of you when we lost our house? When Henry was going through cancer treatment and we were drowning in medical bills? Where was the community support then?" She looked around the room. "We're doing this legally and properly. If we recover anything of value, we'll pay our debts, secure our future, and yes, we'll contribute to this town. But we won't be bullied into giving up what's legally ours." They left the meeting to a mixture of silence and muttering. Outside, Carl Stevens caught up with them. "That took guts," he said quietly. "But you need to understand, people are scared. This town has been dying slowly for decades. The cannery closed, the fishing dropped off, young people leave and don't come back. If there's a chance at something that could revive things, people are desperate enough to fight for it." "We're not the enemy," Henry said tiredly. "I know that," Carl replied, "but desperation makes people ugly. Watch yourselves." Over the next week, things escalated. Someone spray-painted "thieves" on the side of the trailer. Their truck's tires were slashed. Margaret started carrying pepper spray, and Henry kept a baseball bat by the door. But worse than the local hostility was what came next. A law firm representing the descendants of the Northern Star's original crew filed a claim, arguing that the ship and its contents belonged to their family members' estates. A Russian maritime company, claiming to be the successor to the Soviet shipping bureau that had owned the vessel, filed its own claim. And most troubling, a shadowy corporate entity called Arrowhead International filed a claim stating they'd purchased the rights to all abandoned Soviet vessels in Alaskan waters in a 1997 agreement. Diane Chan called them with updates every few days, her voice tight with frustration. "They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," she said. "The crew descendants' claim is weak. The vessel was clearly abandoned by the crew, so they have no standing. The Russian company claim is more complicated, but I'm arguing that the Soviet Union's dissolution invalidated their ownership. The Arrowhead International claim is the concerning one. If they actually have documentation of purchasing rights to abandoned vessels, we might have a problem."
"Can you fight it?" Margaret asked.
"I'm going to try. But I need you to understand, this case could take years, and in the meantime, you're sitting on a fortune you can't touch, being threatened by federal agents and harassed by your neighbors." That night, Henry's cancer pain flared up worse than it had in months. Margaret found him doubled over in the bathroom at 3 a.m, his face grey, his hands shaking. She wanted to take him to the hospital, but he refused. "We can't afford it," he gasped, "and I'm not letting them see me weak." She held him until the pain subsided, tears streaming down her face. This was killing him. The stress, the uncertainty, the constant pressure. They were 73 and 74 years old. They should be worrying about grandchildren and gardens, not legal battles and federal agents. But in the morning, Henry was up again, determined. "We don't quit," he said. "We've come too far." Then something unexpected happened. It started with a phone call from a number Margaret didn't recognize. When she answered, a woman's voice said, "Mrs. Davidson, my name is Patricia Reynolds. I'm a reporter with the Seattle Times. I'd like to talk to you about your salvage claim." Margaret almost hung up, but something made her pause. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Patricia said. "I've been investigating maritime salvage cases for a story, and yours caught my attention. Elderly couple finds abandoned Cold War vessel. Federal government tries to seize it. Local community turns hostile. That's a hell of a story." "We're not looking for publicity," Margaret said carefully. "No," Patricia agreed. "But publicity might be the only thing that protects you. Right now, the government can pressure you quietly. Corporations can tie you up in legal proceedings nobody notices, and you have no allies. But if this becomes a public story, if people know what's happening to you, it becomes much harder to make you disappear." Margaret thought about that. Diane had advised them to stay quiet, to not talk to the media. But Diane was fighting a legal battle. This was something else, a different kind of warfare. "Let me talk to my husband," Margaret said. She and Henry discussed it for hours. Walt, who'd stayed in Cold Point to help them, weighed in as well. "She's right about the publicity," he said. "Right now, you're vulnerable. But if this becomes a David versus Goliath story, if public opinion swings your way, it changes the dynamics. Politicians don't like being seen as bullies picking on elderly couples." They called Patricia Reynolds back and agreed to an interview. She drove up from Seattle 2 days later, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a notebook that had seen better days. They told her everything, showed her documentation of their salvage claim, photographs of the ship, copies of the threatening letters from Arrowhead International, everything except the exact contents of the vault. "And you're certain there's something valuable in that vault?" Patricia said. It wasn't quite a question. "We're certain the government thinks there is," Henry replied carefully, "and we're certain multiple entities are fighting very hard to take it from us." The story ran on the front page of the Sunday Seattle Times 2 weeks later. The headline read, "Elderly Alaska couple fights government, corporations over Cold War treasure ship." Patricia had done her research, connecting the dots between the Northern Star's appearance in 1983 and declassified information about Cold War defection operations. She'd interviewed maritime law experts who confirmed Henry and Margaret's legal standing. She'd gotten statements from the federal agents who'd visited them, carefully worded non-denials that only made them look worse. And she'd written it all in a way that made it impossible not to root for the Davidsons, the elderly couple drowning in medical debt, fighting against impossible odds, just trying to secure their future against institutional powers that wanted to take everything from them. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story was picked up by national news outlets. Cable news shows called requesting interviews. A GoFundMe page started by someone they'd never met raised $30,000 in the first week.
Letters and emails poured in from strangers offering support, legal advice, even their own stories of fighting government overreach. And with the attention came allies. A veterans advocacy group, hearing that Henry had served in the Navy, offered legal support. A maritime workers' union, angered by corporate attempts to seize the ship, pledged assistance. A non-profit focused on protecting individual property rights added their voice to the cause. Agent Cooper called Diane Chan, furious about the publicity, threatening obstruction charges. Diane's response, which she happily shared with Henry and Margaret, was simple. Charge them with what exactly? Exercising their First Amendment rights? Good luck with that. But the publicity cut both ways. With attention came scrutiny. The IRS announced an audit of Henry and Margaret's taxes going back 7 years. Agents started interviewing their former neighbors, their children, anyone who'd ever known them, looking for anything that could discredit them. Their daughter called from Oregon, crying, saying federal agents had shown up at her workplace asking questions about her parents, whether they'd ever expressed anti-government sentiments, whether they had connections to foreign entities. Their son called from Texas with similar stories. "Mom, Dad, what have you gotten into?" their son asked, his voice strained. "They're treating you like criminals." "We're not criminals," Margaret said firmly. "We're people exercising our legal rights, and powerful people don't like it." The stress was taking its toll. Henry's health continued to deteriorate. Margaret developed stress-related shingles, painful and exhausting. Walt, watching them both, grew increasingly worried. "Maybe you should take the government's offer," he said one night. "Maybe this isn't worth dying over." "It's not about the money anymore," Henry said quietly. "It's about standing up. My whole life I watched people with power take from people without it. I watched corporations destroy communities, watched government agencies trample individual rights, and I never said anything. I just put my head down and tried to survive." He looked at Walt. "I don't have much time left. The cancer is back, I can feel it. But whatever time I have, I want to spend it standing up, not backing down." 3 months after they'd first filed their salvage claim, Diane Chan called with significant news. "Judge Martinez has agreed to hear preliminary arguments. It's not the final hearing, but it's a chance to address the competing claims and potentially narrow the field. We'll have to go to Anchorage, probably for several days." They prepared as best they could. Henry got pain medication from his doctor, enough to get through however long the hearing took. Margaret organized all their documentation, creating binders that would make any teacher proud. Walt agreed to testify as an expert witness about the vault and what they'd found. The night before they were scheduled to drive to Anchorage, there was a knock on the trailer door. Margaret answered it to find a group of people from town standing there. Not everyone, but maybe 20 or 30 people, including Carl Stevens. "We wanted you to know," Carl said awkwardly, "that not everyone in town is against you. We took up a collection, enough to cover a hotel in Anchorage for a week and some meals. It's not much, but," he shrugged, "you shouldn't have to fight this alone." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Behind Carl, she saw faces she recognized, people she'd taught classes with at the community center, people Henry had helped fix boats for, neighbors who'd shared dinners and summer barbecues over the years. "There's something else," a woman named Susan said, stepping forward. "We contacted the Seattle Times reporter, told her about the harassment you've faced here, but also about the good you've done in this community. She's running a follow-up story tomorrow." Henry came to the door, leaning heavily on Margaret. He looked at the group of people, and for the first time in months, he smiled genuinely. "Thank you," he said simply. After they left, Henry and Margaret sat together on the worn couch in the trailer. Outside, the Arctic night was deep and cold, but inside, something had shifted. "We might actually win this," Margaret whispered. "We might," Henry agreed. "Or we might lose everything. But at least we're not fighting alone anymore." The preliminary hearing was held in a federal courthouse in Anchorage, a modern building that felt intimidating in its institutional coldness. Diane met them outside, briefcase in hand, her expression all business. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "Each party will present their claim. The judge will ask questions, evaluate the legal standing. This isn't about what's in the vault, not yet. This is about who has the strongest claim to the ship itself." They entered the courtroom to find it packed. The government had sent 3 lawyers. Arrowhead International had 5. The Russian Maritime Company had flown in representation from Moscow. The crew descendants had a single attorney who looked overwhelmed. And in the gallery, Patricia Reynolds sat with her notebook, ready to document everything. Judge Martinez was a woman in her 60s, her grey hair pulled back severely, her expression giving nothing away. She looked at the assembled lawyers and parties with something like resignation. "This is quite the crowd for a salvage hearing," she said dryly. "Let's begin. Mr. and Mrs. Davidson, you filed the initial claim. Your attorney may proceed." Diane stood, and for the next hour she methodically dismantled every competing claim. The crew descendants had no standing because the crew had voluntarily abandoned the vessel. The Russian company had no standing because the Soviet Union's dissolution had invalidated their ownership, and they'd made no claim for over 3 decades. Arrowhead International's supposed rights agreement was vague and potentially fraudulent. She'd found inconsistencies in the documentation. The government's position was the most complicated. Their lawyers argued that classified materials on the vessel superseded salvage rights, that national security concerns outweighed maritime law. Diane's response was devastating in its simplicity. If the vessel and its contents are so classified, so important to national security, why did the government leave them abandoned in a public harbor for 43 years? Why did they take no steps to secure the vessel or its contents? Why did they only become interested when my clients exercised their legal rights? The government lawyers had no good answer for that. Judge Martinez listened to everything, asked pointed questions, and finally announced she would issue a written decision within 30 days. In the meantime, the ship and its contents were to remain secured, with no party granted access. They left the courthouse to find a crowd of reporters waiting. Patricia had spread the word about the hearing, and now camera crews from multiple outlets wanted statements. Diane handled it, giving a brief statement about their confidence in the legal process and respect for the court. But the reporters wanted to hear from Henry and Margaret themselves. Margaret stepped forward, Henry beside her, both of them looking small and tired against the backdrop of the federal courthouse. "We're just 2 people trying to secure our future," Margaret said quietly. "We found something that was lost and forgotten. We followed the law, and we're asking for nothing more than what we're legally entitled to. If that's controversial, if that's threatening to powerful interests, then maybe the system is more broken than we thought." The clip aired on national news that night, went viral on social media, and by morning, public opinion had firmly shifted in their favor. But as they drove back to Cold Point, Henry clutched his side in pain, his face pale. Margaret knew they were running out of time. The legal battle might save their future, but it was costing Henry his present, his health, maybe his life. "We have to hold on," she whispered, gripping his hand. "Just a little longer." 30 days felt like 30 years. They waited, Henry's condition worsening, Margaret holding everything together through sheer force of will. Walt stayed with them, helping, supporting, refusing to leave despite his own life waiting back in Anchorage. On day 29, Diane called. "The judge issued her decision early. You need to sit down for this." They sat, hands clasped together, as Diane read the decision. Judge Martinez had ruled in their favor on all major points. The crew descendants' claim was dismissed. The Russian company's claim was dismissed. Arrowhead International's claim was deemed fraudulent and dismissed with prejudice. The government's claim was the only one that remained viable, but with significant limitations. The judge ruled that while national security concerns were valid, The government had waived its rights through decades of inaction. Any classified materials on the vessel would be turned over to proper authorities, but the salvage itself belonged to the Davidsons. "What does that mean exactly?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. "It means the ship is yours," Diane said, "and everything in the vault is yours, minus anything the government can prove is classified material. They have the burden of proof now. They have to specifically identify what's classified and why. Everything else, you keep." Henry and Margaret looked at each other, and for the first time in months they laughed, really laughed, the sound filling the small trailer with something that felt like hope. But Diane's voice turned serious. "The government will appeal. This isn't over, but you've won the first major battle, and more importantly, you've established precedent. They can't just take it from you anymore." That night, as Henry slept fitfully beside her, Margaret lay awake, thinking about everything they'd been through, the threats, the harassment, the fear, the pain. And she thought about what came next, because even with the judge's ruling, the fight was far from over. Outside, the Northern Star sat frozen in the harbor, keeping its secrets, waiting to see what two elderly people with nothing left to lose would do with their impossible victory. The government's appeal was filed within 48 hours of Judge Martinez's decision, exactly as Diane had predicted. But something had shifted in the dynamics. The publicity around the case had made it politically toxic. Senators were getting calls from constituents supporting the Davidsons. Editorials in major newspapers questioned why the federal government was fighting an elderly couple over a ship they'd ignored for 4 decades. 3 weeks after the initial ruling, Diane called with unexpected news. "They want to negotiate," she said. "The Justice Department has authorized a settlement discussion. They're willing to drop the appeal in exchange for access to the vault to identify and remove any classified materials." "And everything else stays with us?" Henry asked, his voice weak. He'd been in and out of the hospital twice in the past 2 weeks. The cancer was spreading, and the doctors weren't optimistic. "Everything else stays with you," Diane confirmed. "They'd document what they remove, provide receipts and fair market value assessments. You'd retain ownership of the ship itself and all non-classified contents. It's actually a very reasonable offer." Margaret looked at Henry, seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, the pain he tried to hide. "We take it," she said. "We take the deal." The official opening of the vault took place on a cold morning in late April, with the ice in the harbor just beginning to break up. Federal agents, Diane Chan, Henry, Margaret, Walt, and an official witness from the Admiralty Court all gathered on the ship in the sealed room they'd created around the vault. Henry sat in a chair they'd brought up for him, too weak to stand for long periods. Margaret stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. They watched as Walt opened the vault one final time, the door swinging wide to reveal the fortune inside. The federal agents worked systematically, examining each container. They identified and removed several containing documents marked classified, technical specifications for Cold War-era surveillance equipment, intelligence reports, microfilm of what appeared to be Soviet military installations. They documented everything, provided receipts, estimated the historical and intelligence value. When they finished, they'd removed perhaps 10% of the vault's contents. Everything else, all the currency, the gold, the bearer bonds, the diamonds, remained. The lead agent, a woman named Sandra Webb, who'd replaced Cooper and Mills, handed Margaret a leather portfolio. Official documentation of everything removed, along with the government's acknowledgement of your legal ownership of the remaining contents. There's also a letter from the Secretary of Defense thanking you for your cooperation and recognizing your service to the country. Henry laughed weakly at that. Service to the country, that's one way to put it. Agent Webb's expression softened. For what it's worth, Mr. Davidson, a lot of us thought the way you were treated was wrong. You did everything legally, and you stood your ground when most people would have folded. That takes courage. After the agents left, Henry, Margaret, and Walt stood in the vault room, looking at what remained. Walt had brought his equipment to do a final count, and they spent the rest of the day cataloguing everything. The final number, after removing what the government had taken, was $273 million in accessible value. The currency would need to be exchanged through proper channels. The bearer bonds would require authentication and careful liquidation. The gold and diamonds would need to be sold through legitimate dealers. But it was real, it was theirs, and it was more money than they'd ever imagined. "What are you going to do with it?" Walt asked as they sat on the ship's deck, watching the sun set over the harbor. Margaret looked at Henry, her partner of 51 years, who was slowly dying but still fighting. "First," she said quietly, "we're going to make sure Henry gets the best medical care available. Experimental treatments, specialists, whatever it takes." Henry started to protest, but she cut him off. "Don't argue with me, Henry Davidson. We have the money now. We're using it." "And after that?" Walt pressed. "After that," Henry said, his voice gaining strength, "we help people. We pay off our debts. We secure our children's futures. We help this town that's been dying slowly for decades. And we make sure nobody forgets about that ship and what it represents." Over the next 6 months, their lives transformed in ways that felt surreal. Henry underwent treatment at a cancer center in Seattle, cutting-edge immunotherapy that his original doctors said showed promise. The cancer didn't disappear, but it stopped spreading, went into a kind of holding pattern that gave him time, precious time. They bought a small house in Cold Point, nothing fancy, just a comfortable place with a view of the harbor and room for their grandchildren to visit. They paid off every medical bill, every debt, every obligation that had haunted them for years. The relief of that alone felt like someone had lifted a physical weight off their shoulders. Their children flew up to visit, and for the first time in years they could afford to host them properly, to take them to dinners, to spoil the grandchildren with gifts and experiences. Their daughter cried when Margaret handed her a check for $50,000, enough to finally fix the roof on her house and pay for her youngest child's college fund. But the real transformation came in what they did for Cold Point. They worked with Carl Stevens and a committee of town residents to establish the Cold Point Community Trust, funded with $20 million. The trust would provide small business loans, education scholarships, infrastructure improvements, and support for families in crisis. The first loan went to a young couple who wanted to reopen the old cannery on a smaller scale, focusing on specialty seafood products for high-end markets. The second went to Tom Bailey, who'd spray-painted their trailer and who came to apologize with tears in his eyes before asking for help expanding his bar into a proper restaurant that could serve tourists. Because tourists were coming now, drawn by the story of the ship and the elderly couple who'd fought the government and won. Cold Point, the forgotten town at the edge of nowhere, was becoming known. And that led to Henry and Margaret's biggest project. They decided to turn the Northern Star into a museum, a memorial to Cold War history, to the ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events, to the idea that secrets eventually come to light. They hired marine architects to assess the ship's condition, structural engineers to design a permanent mounting system that would preserve it even as the ice melted and reformed each year. They brought in museum designers, historians, and educators to help create exhibits. Walt led the restoration work, hiring local workers, teaching them specialized skills, creating jobs that paid well and offered training. The ship's interior was carefully preserved, with crew quarters left exactly as they'd been found, frozen in time. The bridge became an interactive exhibit where visitors could learn about navigation and ice-breaking operations. The engine room became a testament to Soviet engineering. And the vault room, the secret heart of the ship where their fortune had been hidden, became a memorial. They left it largely empty, with just photographs and documents telling the story of Cold War defections, of the dangerous game of intelligence and counterintelligence, of the human cost of political conflicts. On one wall, they mounted a plaque that read, "This vault held secrets for 43 years. It took courage to open it, but greater courage to share what was found. May we always choose transparency over secrecy, truth over convenience, and hope over fear." The museum opened 18 months after they'd first climbed aboard the ship, on a brilliant summer day when the harbor was blue and clear. Hundreds of people attended, locals and tourists, reporters and dignitaries. The governor of Alaska came and gave a speech about perseverance and the American spirit. But the moment that mattered most to Margaret was when the local high school choir sang, and she saw young people from Cold Point standing proud, their town no longer forgotten, their futures no longer limited by geography and economic decline. Henry sat in a wheelchair for the ceremony, his body frail but his eyes bright. He'd made it to this moment through sheer stubborn will and his wife's refusal to let him go. When it was their turn to speak, Margaret pushed his wheelchair to the microphone. "We didn't set out to be heroes," Henry said, his voice amplified across the crowd. "We were just two broke old people who saw an opportunity and took a chance. What we found changed our lives, but more importantly, it reminded us that ordinary people can stand up to extraordinary pressure when they have something worth fighting for." He paused, catching his breath. Margaret's hand found his shoulder. "This ship, this museum, this town, they're our legacy," he continued. "Not the money, not the headlines, but the idea that you're never too old, never too poor, never too powerless to make a difference. You just have to be willing to climb the ladder even when you're scared, even when it hurts, even when everyone tells you to quit." The applause was thunderous, but Henry was looking at Margaret, and she was looking at him. And in that moment, they were back in that borrowed trailer, holding hands in the darkness, deciding to bet everything on a frozen ship and an impossible hope. Walt stood with them, tears streaming down his weathered face. His 10% had made him wealthy beyond his dreams, but he'd donated half of it to establish a technical training program in Anchorage, teaching young people the dying art of precision locksmithing and vault work. The other half had gone into a trust for his grandchildren, but he lived simply, still working because he loved it, still teaching because he believed in passing knowledge forward. In the months that followed, Henry's health stabilized in a way the doctors called remarkable. The experimental treatment had worked better than anyone hoped, buying him time that felt like a gift. He spent his days at the museum, telling stories to visitors, answering questions, always ending with the same message: take chances, stand your ground, fight for what's right. Margaret started a reading program at the local school, using their story to teach about research, perseverance, and civic engagement. She helped students understand maritime law, historical research, and the importance of primary sources. Some of those students would go on to college, to careers they'd never imagined possible, because a teacher showed them that knowledge was power and courage was learnable. The town of Cold Point transformed around them. New businesses opened, young families moved in, the population grew for the first time in 30 years. The cannery employed 42 people. A new hotel went up near the museum, a coffee shop opened, then a bookstore, then a gallery featuring local artists. It wasn't a gold rush, wasn't a sudden boom that would inevitably bust. It was sustainable growth, rooted in community values and careful planning. The Davidson Trust ensured that development happened thoughtfully, that housing remained affordable, that the character of the town was preserved even as it evolved. 2 years after they'd first climbed aboard the Northern Star, Henry and Margaret sat on the deck of the museum ship, watching the sunset paint the harbor gold and crimson. It was a private moment. The museum closed for the day, just the two of them and the ghosts of Soviet sailors who'd abandoned this vessel so long ago. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found it?" Margaret asked. Henry was quiet for a moment. "We'd probably be in some subsidized housing somewhere, scraping by, waiting to die separately because we couldn't afford to stay together. Instead, we're here. Instead, we're here," he agreed. sitting on a ship that changed our lives, in a town that's alive again, with enough money to never worry about heating bills or medical costs, or leaving our kids with debt when we die."
"It doesn't feel real sometimes," Margaret said.
"I know," Henry replied, "but it is real. We made it real by refusing to accept that we didn't matter, that our lives were over, that we should just give up and let the system grind us down." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, careful of his frailty. "I'm proud of us," she whispered. "Me too," Henry said. "Me too." He lived for 3 more years, defying every prognosis, every expectation. He saw his youngest grandchild graduate high school. He walked his daughter down the aisle at her second wedding, refusing the wheelchair, determined to do it on his own 2 feet, even if Margaret had to support him every step. He gave lectures at maritime museums across the country, telling the story of the Northern Star and the elderly couple who refused to back down. When he finally died on a quiet morning in November with Margaret holding his hand and snow falling softly outside their window, the town of Cold Point mourned like they'd lost a founding father. The museum closed for a week. Flags flew at half-mast. People left flowers on the deck of the Northern Star, so many flowers they covered the entire surface. Margaret grieved, but she didn't break. Henry had given her 3 years she'd thought they'd never have, 3 years of dignity and purpose and love. She continued his work, expanding the museum, growing the trust, mentoring young people, telling their story to anyone who would listen. And always she ended with the same words Henry had spoken at that first opening. "You're never too old, never too poor, never too powerless to make a difference." 5 years after Henry's death, Margaret stood on the deck of the Northern Star during the museum's anniversary celebration. She was 78 now, her hair white, her movements slower, but her eyes still sharp, still fierce. The museum had welcomed its 1 millionth visitor that morning, a milestone that would have made Henry laugh with joy. She thought about the day they'd first seen the ship, just a dark shape in the ice, mysterious and impossible. She thought about climbing that frozen ladder, about opening the vault, about standing up to federal agents and corporate lawyers and their own fear. They'd started with nothing, less than nothing, just debt and desperation, and 3 days before losing their last shelter. And they'd ended up changing not just their own lives, but an entire community, proving that ordinary people could still win against overwhelming odds if they were brave enough to try. Margaret looked out over the harbour, at the town thriving on the shore, at the young people working at the museum, at the future her husband had fought so hard to secure. "We did it, Henry," she whispered to the wind. "We really did it." And somewhere, she liked to think, he was smiling.
Anyone can change their story if they're willing to climb the ladder even when they're scared, even when it hurts, even when everyone says to quit. As Margaret Davidson stood on the deck of the Northern Star on that anniversary morning, surrounded by evidence of lives transformed and a community reborn, she understood that the real treasure had never been the money in the vault. It had been the courage to open it in the first place, to stand firm when pressured to surrender, and to share the fortune with those who needed hope as desperately as she once had. Because for Margaret and Henry and everyone who followed their example, the frozen ship wasn't the end of their story. It was where everything finally began. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that courage and hope can change everything, no matter your age.